Imagine like a room full of statistical coders back in the mid 20th century. They're sitting at these heavy metal desks, right? Just staring at stacks of survey responses.
Yeah, and their entire job description is just to look at the data points.
Yeah.
Income, education, zip code.
Exactly. And then they just punch the respondent into a neat little predefined socioeconomic category. That is it, pure administration.
But instead of just mechanically typing, these coders are getting furious.
Right. They're audibly sighing, they're aggressively flipping pages, and like passing this intense moral judgment on complete strangers they have never even met.
Which is so bizarre for data entry. But it was happening because a respondent maybe claimed to be a senior manager, but their education and income suggested they were a mid-level clerk.
So the coders weren't just correcting a data error. They were experiencing genuine moral outrage. They acted as if this anonymous survey respondent was trying to pull a fast one, usurping a status they didn't deserve.
Which completely shatters the illusion that data collection is this purely objective clinical exercise. The coders were offended because they felt a profound disruption in what they perceived as a just social order.
And that bizarre, highly emotional reaction from data entry clerks is literally the spark that ignited one of the most comprehensive frameworks for understanding human conflict ever written.
It really is.
So whether you are prepping for a boardroom negotiation where everyone seems to be speaking past each other, or you're just insanely curious about the underlying mechanics of why people argue the way they do, that coder's frustration is your starting point.
It's the perfect entry point.
We are doing a deep dive today into a truly foundational text. It's called On Justification, Economies of Worth by Luc Boltanski and Laurent Thévenot.
A massively influential piece of work.
The mission of this deep dive is to give you, the listener, a shortcut to being well-informed. We want to provide a totally new lens, a structural grammar, really, through which to view human agreement and societal clashes.
And Boltanski and Thévenot managed to accomplish something extraordinarily rare in modern scholarship here.
Oh, for sure.
They bridged sociology, which historically obsesses over the collective, macro beings like social classes. And they bridged that with economics, which traditionally models the hyper-rational, self-interested individual.
Because the authors argue that both of those disciplines actually have a huge blind spot.
Right. They both secretly rely on a political metaphysics to explain how human beings actually reach agreement without resorting to pure, unmediated violence.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to get to that political metaphysics, we need to stay with our angry statistical coders for just a second.
Yeah, that tension is key.
The authors looked at that specific friction, the grinding gears between an abstract sociological category and a messy, real-life individual. It is a tension we all feel when we are reduced to a demographic, right?
Definitely. The coders were basically trapped between two imperatives.
What do you mean?
Well, on one hand, their institutional role demanded they construct these macro beings, the working class, the bourgeoisie, the managerial elite.
Right, the big buckets.
Exactly. But on the other hand, the individual survey responses constantly leaked these intimate, idiosyncratic details that completely defied those macro categories.
And so when a coder forcibly reclassified a respondent, effectively downgrading their claim status, they felt what the authors call moral reprobation.
Yes. They felt like they were actively punishing an illegitimate claim to worth.
Which led the authors to design an incredibly revealing experiment, basically a guessing game.
Oh, this experiment is so fascinating.
Right. They gathered participants and challenged them to identify the correct social class of a mystery person using a set of clues. But the brilliant part was how they divided those clues up.
Half the clues were what we might call legitimate public criteria. Vital statistics, formal educational attainment, the sheer head count of the company they worked for.
And the other half were intimate, almost voyeuristic details, like their favorite literary genres, the specific sports they watched, the exact make and model of their car.
And the results of that experiment exposed the core mechanism of public justification. The participants who acted like detectives, hyper-focusing on those intimate clues to unmask the mystery person, they were demonstrably more accurate.
They won the game. But their victory was accompanied by a really distinct psychological discomfort.
Yes, they actually felt ashamed.
I mean, it's deeply relatable, right? Especially with our modern anxiety around algorithmic profiling. When an ad algorithm boxes you into a consumer demographic based on your private browsing habits, it feels like a violation.
Absolutely. because we fundamentally reject the idea that our public worth or our societal categorization should be dictated by our private quirks.
Yeah.
We demand a barrier between the intimate and the public.
And that barrier is the foundation of their entire theory. The players felt ashamed because, in a public setting, evaluating another human being based on private details just feels fundamentally unjust.
Right. In your living room with a close friend, sure, you can judge an acquaintance based on their strange taste in movies.
Obviously, we'll all do that.
But the moment the context becomes public, like in the experimental game or a courtroom or a boardroom, that intimate evaluation becomes illegitimate. We are hit with what the authors call the imperative to justify.
So we're forced to abandon our private biases and appeal to a higher, generalizable framework, one that everyone in the room can recognize as valid.
Precisely. We have to justify ourselves.
But if the coders and the game players couldn't use private details to judge people publicly without feeling guilty, what rules were they allowed to use? Who writes the rulebook for public judgment?
Well, the authors argue that this rulebook isn't arbitrary at all. It has a rigid architectural structure, which they call the polity model.
The polity model, which is, for all intents and purposes, the grammar of justice.
Yes. And Boltanski and Thévenot didn't just invent this grammar out of thin air. They reverse-engineered it by examining classic works of political philosophy.
But they don't treat those texts merely as historical artifacts, do they?
Not at all. They treat them as blueprints. They extract the underlying axiomatic structure that any political philosophy must possess to be considered universally valid.
And they reveal that this exact same philosophical structure is what ordinary people use in everyday disputes.
Exactly. It's how we all argue.
Let's look at the mechanics of this grammar, because it's not enough to just list the rules. We really have to see how they operate together.
Right. The model relies on 4 foundational axioms.
The first one is common humanity. You cannot even begin to construct a justifiable argument unless you establish that everyone involved belongs to a shared human family.
Everyone has to be equally capable of reaching an agreement. It acts as the absolute baseline.
Right, because any framework that posits a separate class of subhumans or inherent slaves instantly fails the test of public justification in a modern democratic society.
It fails immediately. But common humanity alone isn't enough to build a functioning society. Society requires structure and action.
Which introduces the second axiom, differentiation. We're all equally human, but in any specific situation, there must be a hierarchy, or what the authors call states of worth.
Right, because not everyone can be the CEO. Not everyone can be the project lead. Some people will occupy a state of worthiness, and others a state of deficiency.
And here is where the friction usually starts in real life. I mean, how does a society tolerate this contradiction?
It's a huge contradiction.
We declare absolute equality in our common humanity, yet we enforce strict inequality in our daily operations. How do you prevent that from sparking an immediate revolt?
You bridge that gap with the third axiom, investment or sacrifice.
Okay, break that down.
The person occupying the higher state of worth cannot just claim it arbitrarily. They must demonstrate a specific sacrifice of their own self-centered pleasure or private desires.
And the fourth axiom, the common good, is the mechanism that finalizes the justification, right?
Exactly. The wealth, status, or power acquired by the worthy person through their sacrifice must ultimately cascade downward. It has to benefit the deficient.
So the hierarchy is only legitimate if it uplifts those at the bottom.
But that's the only way it holds together.
To visualize how these 4 gears turn together, think about a modern startup for a second. You have a founder who takes a massive payout, maybe 100 times what the entry-level engineers are making.
A very common scenario.
How does the founder justify this in a company all-hands meeting without causing a riot? They have to speak this exact grammar. First, common humanity. They'll say, we are all a team, we all share the same vision for this company.
Right. And then second, differentiation. But I am the CEO and the buck stops with me.
Exactly. Third, investment. I mortgaged my house, I slept under my desk for 3 years, I sacrificed my personal life to build this.
And fourth, the common good. Because of my sacrifice and leadership, we secured the funding that pays all your salaries and keeps this product alive.
It's a perfect justification. If any one of those axioms is missing or proven false, the justification collapses and the hierarchy is viewed as totally illegitimate.
To further prove the necessity of this exact structure, the authors analyze a system that famously fails these axioms. They examine Francis Galton's theories of eugenics.
And it is crucial to note here, for you, the listener, that the authors are not analyzing eugenics to debate its horrific historical implementation.
No, not at all.
They are looking at it to dissect why its underlying logic is fundamentally incapable of forming a valid public agreement. It is basically a structural autopsy of a failed philosophy.
Precisely. Eugenics attempted to construct a hierarchy of human value based on biological and racial metrics. Structurally, it fails the polity model immediately by denying the axiom of common humanity.
Right, because it explicitly categorizes people as irremediably unequal at birth.
Furthermore, it introduces a fatal temporal asymmetry regarding the common good.
Oh, that's interesting. How so?
Well, the sacrifice it demands often involves disenfranchising or eliminating current living populations for the theoretical benefit of unborn future generations.
And you cannot form a reciprocal, justifiable agreement with people who do not yet exist while subjugating those sitting right across the table from you.
Exactly. Because it shatters the grammar of justice, any argument rooted in eugenics cannot be deployed to resolve a public dispute legitimately. It is just structurally bankrupt.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It means that whenever you enter a debate, whether you are arguing for a promotion or debating municipal tax codes, you cannot simply declare, I want this because it benefits me.
Or, I deserve this because I am inherently superior.
Right. You are bound by the imperative to justify. You must prove that your elevated status or your specific demand operates through a sacrifice that ultimately serves the common good of everyone in the room.
But the brilliance of Boltanski and Thévenot's work is recognizing that the common good is not a monolith.
Yeah, that's huge.
There is no single universal definition of what constitutes a valid sacrifice or a collective benefit.
Which brings us to the real core of the text. Once you understand the blank architectural blueprint of a valid argument, you have to look at the different materials you can use to build it.
And the authors identified 6 distinct worlds or polities of worth. 6 completely different flavors of justice that we switch between constantly in our daily lives.
Let's get into those, because they map each of these 6 worlds to a foundational philosopher who codified its specific grammar, right?
Yes, but we should approach these not as abstract history, but as active operating systems that run our modern institutions.
Okay, let's thoroughly examine the first operating system, the inspired polity. The authors use St. Augustine and his monumental work, The City of God, as the blueprint here.
Right, and for a modern audience, the concept of inspiration often gets watered down to just having a good idea. But the inspired polity demands something much more radical.
In the inspired world, worth is entirely decoupled from logic, financial accumulation, or public esteem. Worth is generated by grace.
It is the sudden, unpredictable manifestation of a higher truth. Augustine's City of God contrasts the eternal divine city with the earthly city, which is bogged down in politics, greed, and routine.
So to be worthy in the inspired polity, one must actively sever ties with earthly habits.
Yes. The required sacrifice in this world is fascinating because it goes against everything we are taught in a professional environment.
Yeah, you literally have to sacrifice stability. You must reject schedules, sacrosanct principles, and the comfort of routine. If you are rigid, you cannot be a vessel for inspiration.
The text highlights this through a really striking anecdote from the traditions of the Desert Fathers. It focuses on Abba Moses the Fool.
Oh, I love this story. So a powerful magistrate travels deep into the desert specifically to seek the wisdom of Abba Moses. And on his journey, the magistrate encounters an old man.
Right. He demands to know where the renowned ascetic cell is located. And the old man looks at the magistrate and asks, "What do you want with him? He's a fool."
And when the magistrate finally arrives at the gathering of monks and complains about the disrespectful old man he met on the road, he discovers that the old man was Abba Moses.
Abba Moses exemplifies the absolute peak of inspired worth. He is so completely detached from the human desire for recognition, so indifferent to his own reputation, that he freely slanders himself to a powerful official.
His willingness to appear as a fool, his total lack of ego, is the undeniable proof of his state of grace.
And when we map this onto the modern world, the translation is just seamless.
It really is. Think of the erratic visionary artist or the chaotic tech founder who famously refuses to wear a suit, sleeps under their desk, and rejects every piece of advice from their board of directors.
They operate purely on the belief that a singular stroke of genius, a moment of disruptive inspiration, will solve the problem.
Right. In their world, the venture capitalists who want quarterly projections and strict timelines are the deficient ones. They are bogged down in the earthly city of routine.
However, a society cannot run entirely on unpredictable strokes of genius. The chaos of pure inspiration eventually necessitates structure.
Which transitions us to the second operating system, the domestic polity.
The philosophical anchor here is the 17th century French theologian and court preacher Jacques-Benin Bossuet.
In the domestic world, the erratic individualism of the inspired founder is completely replaced by deep, binding networks of personal dependency.
Right. Worth is not found in breaking the rules. Worth is found in knowing your exact place within a hierarchy of tradition and trust.
And Bossuet articulated this through the concept of the king's body. In this framework, society is a massive, interconnected physical entity.
The individual does not exist as a free-floating independent agent. You are always a node in a network of lineages, mentorships, and familial ties.
Your worth is entirely dependent on the corporate body you belong to and your loyalty to the superior above you.
The phrase the authors pull from the literature to perfectly encapsulate the required sacrifice here is, punctuality is the politeness of kings.
That perfectly illustrates the reciprocal nature of domestic worth, doesn't it?
It really does. The superior, the king, the patriarch, the senior partner must sacrifice their own absolute freedom. They must be reliable, punctual, and deeply invested in the personal welfare of their subordinates.
They owe their dependents protection and guidance, and in exchange, the subordinates offer unquestioning loyalty and deference.
And in this world, worth cascades downward. A servant working for a highly respected, honorable master actually shares in that master's worth.
You see this constantly today in tightly knit family businesses or even in academia, where a graduate student's prestige is heavily tied to the reputation of their thesis advisor.
Exactly. And the supreme violation in the domestic world is pretending to be something you are not.
Right. If a junior employee tries to bypass the chain of command and act like the boss, it isn't seen as disruption like it might be in the inspired world.
No, it is seen as madness. It is a fundamental betrayal of the trust that holds the entire network together.
Yet, as societies expand beyond village-level intimacy and face-to-face trust, the domestic polity begins to buckle.
You really cannot rely on a personal handshake when dealing with millions of strangers?
And this breakdown of intimate trust necessitates a whole new system of evaluation, bringing us to the third framework, the polity of fame.
The authors used Thomas Hobbes and his seminal work, Leviathan, to map this world.
Hobbes offers a profoundly different, almost chillingly pragmatic view of human worth. In the world of fame, your internal virtue, your lineage, or your moments of private inspiration mean absolutely nothing.
Worth is entirely externalized. It depends exclusively on the opinion of others.
Hobbes famously argued that honor is nothing more than the public acknowledgement of power. If the crowd believes you are powerful, you are by definition honorable.
Consequently, the signs that denote worth in this world are fundamentally arbitrary. They only have value because the crowd agrees they do.
We are talking about badges, awards, press coverage, and in our modern context, follower counts and verified checkmarks.
In the fame polity, obscurity is the equivalent of death. If no one recognizes you, you possess zero worth.
Which means the sacrifice demanded in the polity of fame is the complete surrender of one's private, authentic self.
You must mold your personality, your opinions, and your appearance to satisfy the shifting desires of the audience.
Your internal compass has to be overridden by public opinion. The press agent, the public relations manager, the brand consultant, these are the high priests of the fame world.
But the inherent inequality of the fame world, where a few are worshipped and the masses are ignored, eventually sparks a demand for radical equality.
And this rebellion against arbitrary public opinion leads us to the fourth framework, the civic polity.
And here, the authors turn to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his social contract.
Rousseau fundamentally flips the script on both domestic loyalties and the pursuit of fame.
He really does. In the civic world, worth is achieved by abandoning all personal ties, all private interests, and all desires for individual recognition.
You sublimate yourself entirely into the collective general will. You must act exclusively for the good of the whole. You cannot favor your brother, your friend, or your mentor.
If you do, you are considered corrupt. The authors highlight a fascinating historical manifestation of this logic, actually.
Oh, during the French Revolution, right?
Yes. As the architects of the new republic were designing the voting laws, they made a decision that seems incredibly counterintuitive to modern democratic sensibilities. They denied domestic servants the right to vote.
Which sounds crazy to us today. But to understand this through the lens of the civic polity, you have to look at the required mechanics of worth.
The revolutionary lawmakers argued that a servant was too deeply embedded in the domestic world. They were entirely dependent on their masters for survival and social standing.
Therefore, they lacked the crucial independence required to genuinely vote for the general will. The fear was that a master with 50 servants would essentially have 51 votes.
The servant couldn't be trusted to separate their master's private interest from the public good.
Which exposes a massive vulnerability in Rousseau's civic world, and I want to push back on this framework a bit.
Go for it.
If worth demands absolute dedication to the collective, and you must completely erase your private interests, doesn't that inherently breed a society of intense paranoia?
Oh, absolute.
Because human beings always have private desires.
Right.
In a purely civic world, everyone knows everyone else is suppressing their true motives, which means anyone using a language of the public good could secretly be building a faction to serve themselves. It sounds like a panopticon.
Your critique is exactly where the civic polity often fractures. Because internal motives are invisible, the civic world requires constant surveillance and transparency.
You have to continually unmask your fellow citizens to prove they aren't forming secret coalitions or harboring selfish intents.
The sacrifice is the surrender of individuality to the collective. But the ever-present anxiety is that others are merely pantomiming this sacrifice while secretly operating in the domestic or market worlds.
That exhausting paranoia, the stifling nature of constant civic surveillance, creates a desperate need for an outlet where individuals can pursue their own desires without being labeled traitors to the state.
And that pivots us to the fifth operating system, the market polity. The architect here is Adam Smith.
But Boltanski and Thévenot's reading of Smith is much more nuanced than the standard high school summary of The Wealth of Nations, isn't it?
It really is. We often reduce the market to pure, unadulterated selfishness, the idea that greed is good.
Right.
But the authors draw heavily on Smith's earlier, equally important work, the theory of moral sentiments. They argue that for the market polity to function as a justifiable world of worth, it cannot be based on blind solipsistic greed.
It requires the capacity for sympathy and the adoption of the impartial spectator. Explain the mechanics of that, because it changes how we view market interactions.
To succeed in the market world, you cannot just want things for yourself. You have to possess the acute psychological insight to understand what others desire.
You must be able to step outside of your own subjectivity, adopt the perspective of an impartial spectator, and accurately read the desires of the crowd so you can fulfill them through a transaction.
So the core sacrifice in the market world isn't about giving up money. It is about giving up emotional attachment.
You have to detach yourself from your own sentimental valuation of an object. If you own a family heirloom, a piece of jewelry tied deeply to your domestic worth, but the market dictates its price is only worth the weight of the gold, you have to accept the market price.
If you stubbornly hold on to the emotional value, you fail the test of market worth. You must be emotionally detached, yet highly perceptive of others' desires.
Your worth is measured entirely by purchasing power and the ability to strike a mutually agreeable deal in real time.
But the market polity, by its very nature, is chaotic. Prices fluctuate daily. Desires shift. A society cannot build long-term infrastructure solely on the unpredictable whims of daily transactions.
And the need for long-term planning, stability, and objective measurement leads us to the final framework, the industrial polity.
The foundational philosopher here is Henri de Saint-Simon, a utopian socialist who envisioned a world run not by politicians, but by engineers and scientists.
Saint-Simon wanted to replace the governance of people with the administration of things. In the industrial world, worth is entirely decoupled from public opinion, personal loyalty, or market prices.
Worth is based on efficiency, functionality, and scientific measurement.
The universe is conceptualized as a vast, complex machine, and human beings are evaluated based on their competence as operators within that machine.
The sacrifice required here is the subordination of the present moment for the sake of the future. You forego immediate gratification, you endure long years of specialized training, and you adhere to strict standard operating procedures.
All to ensure long-term productivity and reliability. And the ultimate marker of deficiency in this world is inefficiency.
A broken machine, a disorganized workflow, or treating human beings subjectively rather than as measurable variables, these are the sins of the industrial world.
So we now have 6 entirely distinct, fully operational grammar systems for defining what makes a person or an action worthy. Inspired, domestic, fame, civic, market, and industrial.
Yes.
This is where the theoretical architecture hits the pavement, because if I am operating in the industrial world, measuring worth by efficiency, and you are operating in the domestic world, measuring worth by loyalty, How do we ever resolve a dispute?
If we don't share the same grammar, how do we prove who is right?
Exactly.
This is the crux of their theory. We do not resolve these profound disagreements by simply arguing abstract concepts in a vacuum. We rely on the physical world.
Boltanski and Thévenot introduced the concept of the reality test.
Yes, we use specific objects to prove our worth and to force the situation into one specific world.
I love the mechanics of the reality test. It essentially demands that you put your money where your mouth is, but utilizing the specific props and tools of your chosen polity.
To demonstrate how this works when it is successful, the authors describe an Edenic state, a natural, perfect situation where everything aligns.
Imagine an executive taking a group of investors on a tour of a newly built, state-of-the-art manufacturing plant. The assembly line is humming perfectly.
The workers are executing their tasks with flawless precision. The machines are calibrated to the millimeter.
Everyone on the tour observes this and implicitly agrees we are in the industrial world and the worth of this situation is extremely high.
There is no argument. There is no need for anyone to justify anything because the environment perfectly supports the industrial premise. It holds together.
But paradise is incredibly fragile, right? The harmony is instantaneously shattered by a single snag.
As the tour continues, the investors notice a machine violently grinding its gears, spitting out defective parts, surrounded by a pile of scrap metal.
The reality test has just failed.
Exactly. The physical objects, the broken machine, the scrap metal, have intruded and destroyed the Edenic harmony. The manager can no longer just point to the factory. They are suddenly forced to justify the breakdown.
They must explain why the industrial reality is failing to match the industrial ideal. But that scenario is a breakdown within a single world.
The rules are clear. The manager just failed them.
Here's where it gets really interesting. What happens when someone introduces objects from the wrong world entirely? What happens when worlds collide?
This collision is the source of our most intense, seemingly unsolvable societal clashes. A critique in the author's framework occurs when an actor imports a standard of worth or a physical object from one world into a situation that is rigidly governed by another.
The text provides a brilliant, highly relatable example of a university student taking an oral academic exam. The examination room is designed to be a reality test of industrial and civic worth.
It is supposed to measure the student's intellectual competence, their specialized training, and do so in a framework of absolute equality and merit.
But imagine the student walks into the exam room wearing an obscenely expensive bespoke suit, an object screaming of market worth.
Furthermore, instead of answering the questions with clinical academic rigor, the student utilizes incredibly elegant, charming manners, attempting to build a personal rapport with the examiner.
They are deploying the tools of the domestic world. If the examiner is going to maintain the integrity of the academic reality test, they must engage in a willful blindness.
They have to actively ignore the Rolex, the bespoke suit, and the charming smile. They have to strip away the market and domestic objects and force the student to answer the industrial questions.
If the examiner allows the student's wealth or charm to influence the final grade, the test is fundamentally corrupted. An injustice has occurred, and anyone watching would feel that same moral reprobation the statistical coders felt.
The authors show how this mechanism of cross-world critique has been used by massive historical figures to launch societal critiques. They look at Thorstein Veblen's famous economic concept of conspicuous consumption.
Right, Veblen analyzing the Gilded Age wealthy.
Veblen was essentially weaponizing the industrial world to launch a devastating attack on the market world. He observed the ultra-wealthy purchasing useless, highly ornate, ostentatious goods.
In the market polity, this demonstrates high worth because it displays immense purchasing power. But Veblen judged these actions strictly from the standpoint of industrial efficiency.
By applying the industrial grammar, he exposed conspicuous consumption as absurd, wasteful, and entirely non-functional.
The text also points to the French moralists like Jean de La Bruyère, who used cross-world critique to denounce the culture of the royal court.
La Bruyère masterfully exposed the corrosive tension between the domestic world and the polity of fame. In a proper domestic world, a nobleman should be on his estate, honoring his loyalties, managing his dependents, and maintaining his tradition.
Instead, La Bruyère critiqued courtiers who abandoned their true domestic responsibilities to flock to Versailles, simply to chase the superficial, fleeting, and entirely arbitrary opinions of the crowd.
He used the solid grounding of domestic trust to highlight the vapid emptiness of fame.
When you absorb this framework, it fundamentally changes how you listen to people argue. Think about a heated debate in a modern corporate setting over a colleague's potential promotion.
Oh, that's a perfect everyday example.
One faction insists the person deserves the role. They say, look at the data. They hit every KPI, they optimize the supply chain, and they increased quarterly revenue by 20%.
That faction is building an ironclad argument using the grammar and objects of the industrial and market worlds.
But the opposing faction pushes back just as hard. They say, we can't promote them. They are a mercenary. Look at the other candidate. They've been with this department for 10 years. They know everyone's name. They're the cultural glue of this team, and we trust them implicitly.
That faction is arguing entirely from the domestic world. They aren't actually disagreeing on the facts. Everyone knows what the revenue numbers are, and everyone knows who has tenure.
They are disagreeing on the rules of reality that govern the promotion. They are speaking completely different languages of justice.
Which brings us to a perilous juncture. If human interaction is a constant, relentless clash over which world applies to which situation, how does society function?
Why don't we just collapse into a state of permanent, paralyzed conflict?
We survive through Section 5 of our deep dive, assuaging tensions and the delicate art of compromise. Because we can't exist in a state of constant reality tests, we have to build bridges.
The authors refer to these bridges as composite arrangements. Society intentionally constructs compromises that deliberately blend the vocabulary, the values, and the physical objects of fundamentally opposed worlds.
One of the most striking examples from the text, something we say every day without realizing its structural complexity, is the phrase, workers' rights.
It is a profound, everyday peace treaty. If you dissect the phrase using the polity model, you realize it shouldn't exist.
Workers is an identity belonging entirely to the industrial world. A worker is defined by their capacity for production, their efficiency, and their role as an operator within a larger machine.
But the concept of rights belongs strictly to the civic world. Rights are about legal protections, equality, stripping away individual differences, and serving the general will.
The industrial machine doesn't care about rights. It cares about output.
By forcibly welding these two opposing concepts together into workers' rights, society forged a lasting compromise. It acknowledges the inescapable necessity of industrial production while simultaneously demanding civic equality for the human beings operating the machines.
And we don't just build linguistic compromises. We build physical institutions to embody these treaties.
The text uses the classic corporate suggestion box as a perfect example of a composite object.
The suggestion box is an architectural absorber of tension. From one perspective, it functions as a mechanism to gather a list of grievances.
Which is a profoundly civic concept. It gives a democratic voice to the collective, allowing the bottom of the hierarchy to speak to the top.
But simultaneously, management views the suggestion box as an industrial tool. They use it to crowdsource solutions for broken processes, to eliminate workflow bottlenecks, and to increase overall productivity.
The physical box sits on the wall, successfully mediating between the civic demand for voice and the industrial demand for efficiency. It keeps the peace because both worlds can claim ownership of it.
To see how this works on a macro-historical level, the authors dive into the work of the foundational sociologist Emil Durkheim.
They don't just read Durkheim as a theorist, do they? They read him as a master architect of a massive societal compromise.
Durkheim faced a rapidly industrializing society that was terrified of fracturing. Boltanski and Thévenot analyze how he meticulously built an entire moral philosophy that functioned as a grand civic-industrial compromise.
He recognized that the division of labor, the industrial reality, was permanent. But he argued that this division didn't have to destroy human solidarity, the civic ideal.
He theorized that specialized, efficient workers would realize their interdependence, forging a new kind of collective, organic solidarity.
But to make that civic industrial fortress secure, Durkheim had to identify an enemy. He had to actively shunt aside the market polity.
He vehemently denounced the pure pursuit of market self-interest as a corrosive force, labeling it as mere selfishness that would dissolve the social glue he was trying to manufacture.
He built a workable reality by combining two worlds and violently excluding a third. But as the text repeatedly warns, all compromises are inherently fragile.
Very fragile. Because a compromise never actually resolves the underlying philosophical contradiction. It just temporarily papers over it.
It is always vulnerable to being dragged back into a pure reality test and denounced as a sacrifice of principle. If the economy tanks, the industrial side will look at the workers' rights compromise and scream that civic protections are destroying efficiency and bankrupting the company.
Conversely, if management pushes too hard for output, the civic side will scream that human beings are being ground down into mere cogs in the industrial machine.
The composite arrangement is continually threatened by purists from either side, demanding a return to a single, uncorrupted standard of worth.
It is exhausting just thinking about it.
Which leads me to a very practical pushback. We don't have the stamina to engage in these rigorous reality tests every time we have a disagreement. What happens when people just, well, give up?
That's a great point.
Sometimes I walk away from an argument not because a compromise was reached, but because I simply do not have the energy to justify my position anymore.
The authors account for this human limitation perfectly with the concept of the flight from justification. It is the precise moment when the participants in a dispute subconsciously calculate that the energy required to conduct a public reality test is simply too high.
So they just opt out.
They do. One common form of this is what the authors call relativization. The parties essentially throw their hands up and declare, well, that is your truth and this is my truth. We just have different priorities.
They retreat from the public sphere of rigorous justification back into their private subjectivity.
Or they might retreat into a purely private arrangement. If two managers are arguing over resources based on civic fairness versus market potential, and they realize a public debate will ruin them both, they might just make a backroom deal.
They split the budget quietly. They avoid the exhaustion of the public test, but the underlying dispute regarding which world should govern the resources remains entirely unresolved. It is a temporary ceasefire, not a lasting peace treaty.
Recognizing the sheer amount of energy we expend navigating these six worlds, defending our actions, constructing fragile compromises, and occasionally fleeing for the burden of justification entirely, it brings us to the final synthesis of this monumental work.
If we step back and view the entire architecture of Boltanski and Thévenot's theory, the journey is profoundly illuminating. We began in the trenches with statistical coders, witnessing the deep, almost instinctual friction between macro categories and complex individuals.
We uncovered the grammar of valid political philosophy, the strict rules of common humanity, differentiation, investment, and the common good that govern our ability to form a justifiable agreement.
We then mapped the diverse terrain of human value through 6 specific worlds. The unpredictable grace of the inspired polity, the binding loyalty of the domestic world, the externalized power of fame, the collective dedication of the civic sphere, the detached perceptiveness of the market, and the measurable efficiency of the industrial machine.
We examined the mechanics of the reality test, seeing how we deploy physical objects to prove our worth, and how the intrusion of foreign objects causes our most intense societal clashes.
And finally, we explored the fragile, composite compromises like the suggestion box or the concept of workers' rights that keep our institutions from tearing themselves apart every single day.
So what is the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, after navigating this complex sociological architecture? The most vital insight to draw from On Justification is the profound, almost radical optimism embedded in his core thesis.
It is a massive counter-narrative to modern cynicism.
Exactly. We live in an intellectual era heavily dominated by cynical frameworks, theories rooted in pure power dynamics, which dictate that all social interactions, all laws, and all arguments are merely barely concealed struggles for domination and self-interest.
But Boltanski and Thévenot argue something radically different. They argue that human beings possess a deeply ingrained, highly complex moral sense.
They argue that we genuinely care about justice. We do not just want to win. We want our victories to be justifiable. We constantly, sometimes desperately, strive to align our actions with the common good.
When conflicts arise, and they always will, it is rarely because one side is purely malevolent and the other is purely righteous. Conflicts explode because we fundamentally disagree on which specific flavor of the common good applies to the reality we are currently facing.
Armed with this comprehensive framework, you can walk back into your life with an entirely new set of analytical tools. The next time you are in a tense boardroom meeting, or reading a highly polarizing political headline, or even trying to navigate a frustrating argument at a family dinner, you can listen differently.
Instead of just reacting to the surface-level facts or getting angry at the other person's stubbornness, you can pause and ask yourself, which world are they fighting for? Are they defending industrial efficiency? Are they terrified of losing domestic loyalty? Are they demanding civic equality?
Once you identify the specific polity they inhabit, you can actually begin to speak their language. Or at the very least, you can finally understand why they are completely incapable of hearing yours.
It replaces blind emotional frustration with structural analytical clarity.
It truly does.
But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. It is something that builds directly on the implications of the texts afterward, something for you to mull over as you navigate the modern world.
A critical look toward our immediate future.
We have spent this entire deep dive exploring how our society relies on the imperative to justify. We are forced to justify our decisions to one another using these shared grammars of worth to maintain peace, resolve disputes, and uphold human dignity.
But what happens to this entire intricate architecture when we increasingly hand our most consequential decisions over to algorithmic AI systems?
That is a chilling application of the author's framework. Think back to our statistical coders at the very beginning. They felt moral reprobation when a categorization seemed unjust. But algorithms do not experience moral reprobation.
An AI does not feel the agonizing tension of competing worlds of worth. It does not sweat over whether it should apply market logic or civic logic to a specific human life.
If an algorithmic system denies you a mortgage, or screens your resume out of a job application, or dictates your medical care, it does so entirely without a justifiable human narrative.
It executes a decision without the fundamental human capacity for moral reflection or the necessity of public justification.
If the very foundation of human agreement is the ability to demand a reality test and force a justification, are we risking a silent technological slip into the exact kind of unmediated violence and permanent flight from justification that Boltanski and Thévenot warned us about?
If we cannot demand a grammar of justice from the machines that increasingly govern our lives, what happens to our society? Something for you to mull over.
A vital, urgent question for our time. Thank you so much for joining us on this exhaustive deep dive into the mechanics of worth and justification.
It has been an absolute pleasure unpacking this profound text with you.
Until next time, keep questioning the world around you.